Hello, good evening and welcome back. So, we see thousands turn out for UK anti-racist protests, but are they legal and why are they even in the UK when it's a US protest? So, we see that it's now spread out to be a wider anti-racism protester. Similarly has happened in America, although that seems to now just be rioting and looting for rioting and looting's sake. But in the UK, they are still trying to hold true to the narrative. There isn't really one, as we'll get to. But of course, that hasn't stopped them gathering together, because why not? Especially if you're cooped up and then there seems to be an opportunity to be able to get outside, then that's what they want to take. So as we see in London, protesters knelt for a minute's silence before chanting "No justice, no peace" and "Black Lives Matter." And I don't see anybody arguing with that. Yes, lives matter. I mean, some of us don't think we have to bring ethnicity into it, but okay, sure, let's do that. And bear in mind, this is all from the BBC, so take it with a very large pinch of salt. Priti Patel said the social distancing advice was for the safety of all of us, while Met Police Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick said the protests were unlawful. Wasn't anything done about them? No, of course not. And the BBC just plainly say, of the thousands of people who gathered in London's Parliament Square, the majority donned face coverings and many wore gloves. Would you like to hazard a guess as to why they wore face coverings? Is that actually for the coronavirus, or is it maybe so that then they can't be identified? Which is going to be more likely? Some held signs making reference to the virus, including one which read, "There is a virus greater than COVID-19 and it's called racism." Except, there isn't. There really isn't. I want to finish with this first before moving on, but we'll get to why it's not such a big problem that they seem to suggest. So, Anthony Joshua, the boxer, told the crowds, "We can no longer sit back and remain silent on this senseless, unlawful killing and sly racism on another human being." It wasn't a killing, though. It wasn't. In central London, protesters dropped to one knee and raised their fist in the air outside the US Embassy amid chants of "Silence is violence," which it categorically is not, and "Colour is not a crime," and others saying, "White silence is violence," or "White silence is white violence." And although it rhymes and it sounds good, silence is not violence. Surely, let's say everybody was silent, and that's it. They weren't doing anything. They were just completely still. Silent, not violent. Their point is, people are doing things. No one's saying anything. But it's the people doing things that causes the violence, not the people who aren't saying anything. If you really want to go down silence is violence, then we've got to go with snitches get stitches. Surely then we should juxtapose silence is violence with snitches get stitches, if that's how you want to go about things. And we'll get to why that is very, very important when it comes to saying that if you don't talk out, people die. And we'll get to why that is a far worse problem for the black community than police brutality, especially in the UK. So in Glasgow, the woke activists, the anti-racism campaigners, renamed streets that have had links to the slave trade, replacing street signs with the names of enslaved Africans, black activists, and victims of police brutality. They've all got to be black, though. Let's not care about the slaves that existed for centuries within the UK, before the slave trade, before the British found out that Africans were enslaving each other, and therefore bought slaves from Africa, from people who had already enslaved them within Africa. And then, of course, went back centuries later in order to stop slavery in Africa, because if it wasn't for the British, slavery would be far more rampant in Africa than it is now. But let's just gloss over that. Let's just keep the white man's guilt, don't you know? And it clearly is all down to what the white people have to do in order to help out the black people. Because, hey, you know, black people can't take care of themselves, evidently. That's what these protesters keep telling us, that they need intervention. And in Manchester, we've had 15,000 protesters gathered at Piccadilly Gardens. No one cares about social distancing anymore, which is particularly important because it is, of course, unlawful. And as they go on to say, what does the law say about protests? And there are two particular things worth saying here. So, they've said, Dame Cressida Dick, has said officers will seek to uphold the law, as in you can hand out fixed penalty notices at £100, but will have to make a case-by-case decision on what to do. She told the London Assembly on 3rd of June that if they had tried to enforce a mass dispersal at last weekend's protests, we'd probably have ended up with a very serious disorder. Yes, which is why America has brought in the National Guard. That if you have such a problem, if the law is there for a reason, then surely you still want to disperse them. As we've seen 17,000 fines being given out for COVID-19 breaches anyway, why should it be any different for these people, these protesters, unless it's just a political message in which you agree with? In which case, it isn't one law for all, it is unequal treatment under the law to favour people pushing black supremacy and black empowerment. So, tell me again how it's supposed to be a racist institution, as it so blatantly isn't. If it was, you wouldn't get away with this. So, but really, are they legal? Well, we have another take of it, of course, from Barrister Audrey Sherrill-Mogan from London's Garden Court Chambers, that explains the European Convention on Human Rights says that public bodies must respect both the right to assemble and also to express one's views. However, the government or another public body can interfere with them if it has a proper legal reason to do so. It is not like the Constitution in America. The law is at the whim of the government at the time in order to decide how they wish to change it. You don't have any constitutional rights in the UK. Yes, I know about the Magna Carta and common law, but these can be changed as the government wants. Not like in America, that it's far more difficult to change the Constitution with the amendments, of course needing a supermajority or 2/3. Here it is far more straightforward. You don't have any basic rights within the UK. So, she said, if what's being done is to enforce the health regulations, then you can argue that stopping a protest would be reasonable and proportionate. But this is where the context of where we are right now becomes important. What she likens it to is, she argues the police should approach these protests in the same way that officers would consider a park full of sunbathing friends. She's likening protests to sunbathing, but let's get on with the quote in its context. You can see there are people in small groups in parks. It's very difficult to argue they are not all in the park for the same purpose. So if we are talking about stopping a protest, there has to be a fair and just application of the law to these people as well as those in the park. So, of course, we have seen sunbathers dispersed under COVID-19 regulation. So, initially, awful comparison because it doesn't hold water. But secondly, she's likening people who are in a park, who are finding a place to be away from other people, sitting down, staying still, enjoying the sun, and we know that the UV light, of course, kills the virus very quickly, as well as the heat. She's likening that to large bodies of moving people, brushing up against each other, finding new people, interacting. They are not the same at all. When you see that people, small groups in parks, compared to thousands of people in protests, moving as one large collective. These are barely similar, let alone the same. She says, if not, she wants, closing down a Black Lives Matter protest on coronavirus grounds could be seen as unfair and a disproportionate use of the regulations. On the contrary, it would be an equal use of the regulations, which, sure, I disagree with, but if you want equal law and equal application and equality under the law, then you do need to carry out the same regulation against the protests. And that is not what is happening. And that is where, of course, we see silent majority support for the National Guard in America, and we will see a similar thing here to say, stop it. Either we're all now allowed out, which you're saying we're not, because you're just doing it, you're picking and choosing, and that for here, that they're going to allow it to go, but for people who are doing something which isn't politically expedient, like Black Lives Matter, then yes, of course, they will be arrested or fined. So, Dame Christina Dick, again, said, coming together in a gathering is not only unlawful, but also, perhaps more importantly, it is putting yourself and your family at unnecessary risk and other people around you. So, if faced with large gatherings, the officers would seek to uphold the law but make a case-by-case decision as what to do. She said, the right to lawful protest is a key part of any democracy, which UK police uphold and facilitate. And that we ask that people continue to work with officers at this challenging time. So she's basically said, you're not supposed to do it, but you can. You can. Why not? It's politically expedient. You can do it. So again, the rioters are going against British law. They can just override it because it's politically expedient. So why do they resonate in the UK? Well, they're trying to say that, as over the weekend, thousands of people chanted Black Lives Matter, they were marching in support of protesters in America, angered by the death of George Floyd on 25th of May, perhaps, and they say that as a black community, when one is hurt, we're all hurt, because apparently all black people are the same. Who knew? But that's what these black activists are saying. And Shane, 20-year-old, says she and her friends wore military boots to the London protest, and were impressed to see lots of other women dressed like members of the Black Panther movement. This is a violent black supremacy movement, and they were impressed by it. This is not something that you really want to encourage. Such an aggressive, violent movement. And yet, that is exactly what they're doing. And if you're wearing military boots, as they like to point out, then that is obviously the effect that you're trying to have on people. And not something that I would really suggest that you try and do if you're trying to suggest that you're peaceful and aren't deserving of being detained by police because of violence, as we see that how many black people die in police custody in England and Wales. Like, is there actually a problem? Well, over the last 10 years in the UK, England and Wales, not Scotland, or Northern Ireland, England and Wales, over the last 10 years, people who died in police custody, 140 white, 13 were black, 10 were from other minority ethnic groups. So, we see that how it compares to the population, that as from the 2011 census, where black people were 3%, and apparently still are only 3%, nearly 10 years later, despite being 8% of deaths. Wow. And percent of deaths in custody and percent of people arrested, that white people are actually 25% more likely to die in custody than a black individual who had been arrested. So you would have thought, maybe that really blows the narrative out of the water. Bearing in mind as well that black people, or the black community, commit more crime than white people, and more violent crime. As we can take London as an example, that the majority of youth knife offenders are minority ethnic in London. In England and Wales, 38% of knife possession offenders under 25s were non-white. It was 2/3 in London. And of course, using the 2011 census, as they like to, the black or black British total is 13%. And if you really want to be generous and say it's 40%, fine. But the point being that not only is the crime disproportionate among black communities particularly, but minority ethnic as well, it's different types. So, predominantly, for white people, it's white-collar crime, scamming, cheating, that kind of thing. For the Asians or Middle Easterners, of course, it's grooming gangs, sexual exploitation. And for black people, it's particularly violence, homicides, stabbings, knives, guns, that kind of thing. That each group have their own particular niche of crime that they commit. And therefore, when you're going up against the most violent group, you will need the most force in order to detain them, and they're also the most likely to resist arrest, in which case more force is needed to overpower them. And if police don't have adequate training, like in things like grappling, then they're more likely to cause harm to the person that they are arresting. So if you want to make this problem all go away, then we can all agree upon the minimal laws that need to be in place, the maximum training that police need to have, and then respect for the police, and understand that you go along with the police and then sue them later and get a massive payoff instead of resisting them at the time. If we can say that, and at the same time boost the family unit, we will see these numbers just drop off a cliff. They will just decrease rapidly. But until that happens, until there's support for families and entrepreneurial endeavours, and instead it's down to the victimhood narrative, then we're going to continue to see this problem. So, until next time, stay safe if you're in one of the afflicted cities, and as always, have a good one.